Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. My name is Nicole Pizzetto Hollywood, and it's an honor to be with you this morning. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Senators Murphy and Blumenthal for hosting us today and for their fierce advocacy for gun safety. I also want to thank the survivors of gun violence who were with us today, the volunteers with Moms Demand Action and Students Demand Action, and of course, John Feinblatt, the president of Everytown Gun Safety, and Shannon Watts, the founder of Moms Demand Action. We're here today to mark the end of Everytown's road trip for background checks, a 10-day journey in which gun safety advocates traveled across the country, covering more than 16,000 miles and making more than 75 stops in 23 states to create the murals you see behind me and collect personal stories, photos of loved ones killed by gun violence, and letters to Congress. All of that culminates in today's event, where we are delivering these heartfelt materials to the Senate, represented today by Senators Blumenthal and Murphy. Those of us participating in this campaign represent the depth, breadth, and diversity of the gun safety movement. We are survivors. We are Democrats and Republicans alike. We are gun owners. We are veterans and sportsmen. We are faith leaders in law enforcement. We are elected officials, celebrities, and more. All of us have come together from our different parts of the country and our different walks of life to deliver one simple message. We need more than thoughts and prayers from our elected leaders. We need action on background checks, and we need it now. I am a gun owner, and like everyone here today, I fully support the Second Amendment. And I'll be the first person to tell you that background checks are the common sense constitutional policy we need to save lives in this moment. Background checks aren't about taking away or burdening legal gun owners. They're about ensuring that people who shouldn't have guns can't buy them from a total stranger selling guns at a gun show or online with no background check and no questions asked. So make no mistake, just because today is the end of the road trip, it's just the beginning of our efforts to urge the Senate to act. With the help of the other speakers today and everyone who participated in the road trip, we will stop at nothing to pass landmark background check legislation into law. This is our moment to act, and we must seize it. And with that, I'll hand it over to our first speaker today, Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you so much. I'm really proud to be here with my friend and colleague and partner in this effort, Senator Murphy, to welcome Moms Demand Action and Students Demand Action to the Capitol, and to thank you. You have brought us the voices and faces of America. You have brought us the cries of America for gun safety. You have brought us the voices and faces of loved ones who have lost members of their families, their friends, their coworkers, and who are saying, enough is enough. The time for thoughts and prayers alone has passed. You are rightly demanding action from this Congress, which has remained complicit for too long, complicit by inaction. What is different now than before is, in fact, this grassroots political movement that is going to triumph over the forces arrayed against us. The gun lobby is in disarray. It has, in effect, declared bankruptcy, not just financial bankruptcy, but moral bankruptcy, divided by its corruption and dishonesty. But what is positive, and ultimately what will prevail here, is the great spirit and eloquence of these voices and faces. This picture is worth 1,000 words. This picture speaks for America. It is common sense steps that can stop gun violence. Background checks, making them apply to every gun purchase, closing a loophole that enables ineligible people to buy a gun simply because 72 hours has expired without completing a check. Emergency risk protection orders, the red flag statutes that the President of the United States has called for, banning ghost guns, not just an executive order, but a law forbidding them. Safe storage, like Ethan's law, that would have saved Ethan Song's life in Connecticut. And an end to the sweetheart deal that has given the gun manufacturers complete immunity from responsibility legally. These kinds of common sense steps can be achieved, and we will have a vote. We will have a vote on background checks and closing the Charleston loophole. These voices deserve to be heeded and heard. They are America speaking to the Congress, and your trip across America has enabled them to be heard and heeded. I want to thank you, John Feinblatt, and Shannon Watts, for bringing them here to the Senate so that my colleagues and I can put them into action as we have a moral obligation to do. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator. We'll now turn it over to Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Nicole, John, Shannon, Reverend, Jenny, to the advocates behind me. Thank you for being such an inspiration. Last weekend, a little 3-year-old boy who was sitting in the back seat of a car with his 4-year-old and 5-year-old sibling on a street in the north end of Hartford. In the front seat was his mother and her friend. A black Honda Accord pulled up next to that car, and those in the Honda fired into the car containing those 3 children. The 3-year-old died. The 4- and 5-year-old siblings, the mother, survived. The 3-year-old gunned down dead in the middle of a Sunday afternoon in the streets of Hartford. And deservedly, that crime captured our state's attention. One of approximately 100 people that day across the country who died from a gunshot wound. And I want you to think about that little boy, but I also want you to think about his 2 siblings. Think about his mother. Think about his cousins and his grandparents. Think about all of the lives that are fundamentally changed when something that cataclysmic happens. Those 2 other kids sitting in that back seat, they will have a memory of that will scar them for the rest of their lives. And the guns that are used in these crimes in Hartford are more often than not illegal guns that are trafficked into our state, bought outside of our state, often in places where you don't have to do universal background checks. We have universal background checks in Connecticut, but these guns don't care about state borders. And until we have a federal law that requires a background check to be done everywhere, then you are going to wake up on many days to news of 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds being shot on Saturday and Sunday afternoons. That can't happen in this country, and now is the moment. I've been on the phone over the course of the last several weeks with my Republican colleagues. I see a pathway to get a bill done to dramatically expand the number of background checks that are done in this country. But I also understand that we have a bill that's passed the House of Representatives that is supported by 90% of the American public. 90% of the American public support the bill that has already passed the House of Representatives. And while many of us remain open to compromise with our Republican colleagues, we should ask ourselves why there should be any need for compromise on a bill that already has 9 out of 10 Americans supporting it. The people of this country have done their job. In fact, they've done everything a democracy would have asked of them. They have elected a House of Representatives that supports universal background checks. They kicked out of office in 2018 and 2020 over 30 members of Congress who were A-rated by the gun lobby. Then, last fall and last winter, the voters empowered a United States Senate that supports universal background checks. In Georgia, they had 2 candidates that opposed universal background checks on the ballot and 2 candidates who supported universal background checks. And they came to the polls and decided that they wanted a Senate controlled by a party that supports universal background checks. And then, of course, they put into the White House a champion of anti-gun violence measures. The voters have done everything we and democracy asks of them. Now it's our turn. Now it's our turn to show America that democracy can work and pass a piece of legislation that is supported by the vast, overwhelming majority of the American people, a piece of legislation that will unquestionably save thousands and thousands of lives. Thank you for traveling the country, for collecting the stories of these heroes, families and individuals who are still suffering from grief but have the courage to be able to tell their stories. Thank you for delivering these pieces of both tragedy and inspiration to Senator Blumenthal and I. We will share them with our colleagues. We are going to muster all of the intellectual and emotional energy that we can find to get a background checks bill passed here in the United States Senate. We don't have time to waste. We don't want to wake up to more headlines like we did in Connecticut last weekend. It is in our power to make sure that democracy still can deliver on an issue that enjoys 90% public support. Thank you very much for having us both.
Thank you, Senator. I'll now turn it over to John Feinblatt, the president of Everytown for Gun Safety in America.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and certainly thank you, Senator Blumenthal and Senator Murphy. There really are no 2 greater champions of gun safety than these 2 Connecticut senators, and we owe them so much gratitude for continually leading the charge to make this country safer. My job today is pretty straightforward. I'm going to try to answer 2 questions that I've been asked time and time again. The first is, why does the Senate need to act now on gun safety? And the second is, what's changed since 2013, which was the last time the Senate considered a background check bill? The argument for acting now is pretty simple. It's also pretty scary. Right now, we're experiencing a gun epidemic, a gun violence epidemic within the COVID pandemic. The numbers are bracing. You only have to compare 2019 to 2020 to see how scary they actually are. At least 4,000 more Americans were killed with a gun in 2020 than in 2019. Homicides increased by nearly 40% in 57 of our largest cities. And we saw the largest year-to-year jump in homicides in half a century. So what's driving this spike? I'll give you 3 factors. First, gun sales soared during COVID, straining an already porous background check system. Second, all of us know this, COVID has cruelly cut holes in our nation's safety net, beginning with the fact that schools closed last March and in many instances have still yet to return. Third, there is no question that police community relations have been frayed after the murders of Daunte Wright, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. And while some people thought we'd see fewer mass shootings with America in lockdown, that's just not been the case. Just think about the terrible tragedies in Atlanta and in Boulder in the last month. And remember, when it comes to gun violence, there is no vaccine. There's no vaccine on the horizon. Our best hope is for passing life-saving legislation. So that's the challenge we're facing. But there's also reason for optimism, which brings me to the second question. What's changed since 2013? The short answer is a lot has changed. And let me give you a number of proof points. First, just look at the grassroots. Put simply, the gun safety movement has never been stronger, while the NRA has never been weaker. Today, just today, right now, is a great example. Right now, we're fighting for action in the Senate, while the NRA is fighting for its life in a Dallas bankruptcy court. Second reason, look at where the American people stand. Both senators mentioned this. There's an overwhelming stats that tell us, overwhelming polling tells us that 93% of voters support background checks, including 89% of both gun owners and Republicans. That's because the American people know a simple truth. This isn't a right issue or a left issue. It's a life or death issue. Third reason, look what's happening all across the country in state houses. We're passing common sense gun safety laws in red, blue, and purple states. 21 states have passed background checks. 19 states have passed red flag laws. And 30 states have passed laws prohibiting convicted abusers from possessing guns. But let's remember, states are the curtain raiser, Congress is the finale. Which brings me to my fourth point. Just look at the recent election. Senator Murphy mentioned this as well. The American people chose a gun sense trifecta to represent them in Washington, including President Biden. You know, I had the privilege of working closely with then Vice President Biden after Sandy Hook. And I saw firsthand how deeply he feels the pain of gun violence, how personal it is to him. So I know that background checks are unfinished business for the president and that he will do everything he can to urge the Senate to act. Because let's be blunt, let's be frank with one another. The cost of delay can be measured in human lives. And that cost is already far, far too high. It's time to pass background checks, and we will not rest until the Senate does exactly that. Thank you. Thank you for having us today.
Thank you, John. I'll now turn it over to Shannon Watts, founder of Moms Demand Action.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Senators Murphy and Blumenthal, and everyone here today as we conclude our cross-country road trip for background checks. Over the past 10 days, these murals have traveled different routes all across the country, totaling over 16,000 miles in 23 states, making 76 COVID-safe stops before today's finale. For example, one mural started in Alaska before making its way to Oklahoma City, where a faith leader joined survivors of gun violence and Moms Demand Action volunteers to demand more than thoughts and prayers from lawmakers. Then it was off to Norman, Oklahoma, where the chapter leader handed the mural over to an Air Force veteran, a gun owner, and a proud grandfather. He then took it to Tulsa, where the mural was received by a former law enforcement officer and survivor who signed it before driving it over the border to Missouri. And today, a gun violence survivor in Washington, D.C., here in town, signed it. Other murals traveled to places like Greenville, Chicago, Dayton, and Camden, communities that have experienced far too much gun violence that gets too few headlines. And in communities like Boulder and Atlanta, Parkland, Newtown, Dayton, Santa Barbara, cities devastated by mass shooting tragedies, these murals brought together survivors and supporters to honor the victims by demanding action. These murals, their journey, and the signatures on them represent the commitment of our volunteers and the grassroots movement calling for action to end the gun violence epidemic. It's a movement made up of over 6 million supporters, mothers and fathers, faith leaders in law enforcement, veterans and teachers, students and seniors, gun owners and survivors of gun violence. It's important to remember that this movement includes Democrats and Republicans, because the only place where common sense gun safety laws are polarizing is inside the Capitol, here in Washington, D.C. Over 1,000 people were shot and killed in America just since these murals journeys began, and thousands more were wounded. And that's what this road trip and these murals are all about. To remind our senators that passing background checks isn't just the right thing to do, it's also a popular thing to do. Over 90% of Americans in red, blue, and purple states stand in support of passing common sense gun laws. When I started Moms Demand Action over 8 years ago, volunteers across the country quickly mobilized, organized, and fought for the Manchin-Toomey background checks effort that followed. As John mentioned, we fell a few votes short, but our volunteers quickly realized that the fight for gun safety wouldn't start in Washington, it would end here. So for nearly a decade, we've worked in city halls, boardrooms, school boards, and in state houses to build momentum. We've passed dozens of gun safety laws in red states, blue states, purple states, and we've helped stop the NRA's agenda in 90% of the time, every year, for the last 5 years. And how did we do that? By never giving up. We knew eventually the momentum created by the unglamorous, time-consuming, and sometimes heartbreaking heavy lifting of grassroots activism would eventually point the right president and the right Congress in the right direction. This is that Congress. This is that moment. Now is the opportunity to act and to build on the momentum and to pass background checks legislation. While this road trip may have just ended, the grassroots movement and our 6 million supporters are just getting started. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. I'll now hand it over to Reverend Emmanuel Lipscomb, a survivor of multiple incidents of gun violence and a longtime advocate for gun safety.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and to all the speakers for being here today, especially Senator Murphy and Blumenthal. Your advocacy gives voice in the Senate to those of us on the ground trying to save lives every day. You know, there's an old saying, when you're having an event and you want it to end on time, don't ask a minister to speak. But I'll do my best to stay on time today. My name is Reverend Emmanuel Lipscomb. I'm here in D.C., and I've been a survivor of gun violence for nearly as long as I can remember. When I was just 5 or 6, often my mother would tell us to stay close to the floor and away from the windows because there was a shooter outside of the house. When I was in middle school, I heard gunshots and ran into the hallway, and there was the vice principal bleeding to death on the lobby floor. And since then, there have honestly been too many incidents of gun violence to recount or remember. I have hidden in cars while bullets flew by the windows. I've sheltered at a gas station while bullets whizzed overhead. I've had a shotgun pulled on me and stuck in my ribs, and I've had family members and friends shot and killed. You know, people often tell stories about how their lives, their senses of safety, were shattered by their first brush with gun violence. And I completely understand that. But for me, and for many folks across the country who grew up in cities like I did, these experiences with gun violence are just something just as painful. They're normal. That's what happens when you grow up in a country where more than 100 people are killed by gun violence every day, and hundreds more are wounded. The unthinkable becomes normal. The once-in-a-lifetime occurrence happens every day. The fight and flight reflex kicks in when you're a child and never turns off. Because if it did, you'd be dead. But we're here today to say that this doesn't have to be this way. The evil of gun violence is within our power to fix. I'm a Reverend, and one thing that's true in all religions that they are fundamentally about what is good versus what is bad. That which brings death versus that which brings life. We've been going down this death road too long. We need to go another way and start instead to choose life. To do that, we need more than thoughts and prayers from our elected leaders. We need action on gun safety that starts with the passing of life-saving background checks legislation. Because I've spent most of my life in the deepest parts of the streets, and no matter what you hear on TV, I can assure you that most people in this country are good. They're just constantly living a life in a cycle of abuse. They're living a life at gunpoint, just like I have. But now, after 25 years of waiting, we have a chance to break that broken cycle of broken people. A chance to make sure no 5 or 6-year-old kid has to hide from bullets instead of playing hide and seek like I did. A chance to build a country where, for the people like me, peace, not violence, is finally our normal. It's going to be a long road, but by passing background check legislation, we can begin to do exactly that. Thank you.
I know that Senator Blumenthal has to leave, but Shannon and I both wanted to give him just some of the thousands of letters that we've received from survivors across the country during this road trip, and hope that you can share them with your colleagues. And so these are just some, but they are the heartfelt wishes and pleas from survivors that Congress act and keep their families safe. Senator.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to just say again, what we have here is America speaking. More than 90% of the American people have said, we want common sense steps to end gun violence. I will take these messages from all of you who have said to us, enough is enough. The time for action is now. Thank you to Everytown, Moms Demand Action, for conveying this message to me and my colleagues. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I'll now turn it over to Jeannie Shue.
Thank you very much to Nicole and to all of the other leaders here for their relentless advocacy on gun safety. especially Senators Blumenthal and Murphy. My name is Jeannie Shah. I'm a high school senior, a proud Asian American woman, a gun violence survivor, and a member of Students Demand Action's National Advisory Board. On May 31st, 2019, I received a chilling text from my dad about an active shooter in his workplace. For the next 4 hours, my mom and I waited in agony in a police-restricted parking lot to pick up my dad without knowing if he was okay or not. Finally, he rounded the corner. Tears streamed down my eyes as we hugged him tight. When we got home that night, my dad drew diagrams to show how he barricaded himself in his office and blocked the door with furniture, how he considered jumping out of his window to escape, how the shooter was in the room right next to him. My dad survived the shooting, but 12 of his coworkers did not, and 4 more were wounded. Needless to say, countless other families suffered the direct impact of gun violence that night. My Virginia Beach community was torn into shambles. The trauma of gun violence is something I wouldn't wish on anyone. And that's why I'm in the fight for gun safety, so no one else has to go through what my family and community went through on that terrifying day. Nearly a month ago, I was working on an essay for my English class when I saw the notification on my phone, yet another mass shooting in Boulder. All of my psychological scars, already raw from the previous week's mass shooting in Atlanta, were ripped open once again. It's the way I felt this week, learning about the murder of Dante Wright and the school shooting at Austin East High School in Tennessee. Beyond the gun violence that makes the headlines, it's important to also recognize that hundreds of more people and communities suffer from gun violence every single day. They deserve attention and action too. But let me take a moment to address the hate-fueled shooting in Atlanta, in which 6 Asian women were killed among 8 total victims. During the pandemic, there have been thousands of hate-based incidents against Asian Americans, which represent only a mere fraction of what we've experienced. The Atlanta shooting followed all too familiar patterns of violence against women, especially Asian women. We've been targets of racism, xenophobia, and misogyny for generations. These forms of discrimination have snowballed into the hatred that fueled the shooting. Hatred like this is most dangerous when it's paired with easy access to firearms, but we can do something about that. Right now is the time for more than thoughts and prayers. Right now is the time for life-saving action on background checks. Right now is the time to act. This is not a partisan issue. Democrats, Republicans, and independents agree we need background check legislation now. This year, I'll be turning 18 years old. In my lifetime, I've witnessed the impacts of gun violence firsthand. I've experienced the demeaning microaggressions that come with being an Asian American woman. I've been empowered to fight for justice and equity. But one thing I haven't yet seen is federal action on gun safety. Young people in the United States have been waiting our entire lives for this. It's time we get it.
Thank you, Jeannie. And thank you for all the powerful remarks today. We'll now open it up for questions. I'll call on you one by one. And please be sure to direct your questions to whomever you would like to answer them. And with that, let's open it up.
Out of curiosity, there's been some talk as the background check bills move from the House to the Senate that they may be amended in some sort of way. What sort of amendments are there any you'd like to see, and what would be too far for the changes in the background check bills that passed the House that are awaiting a vote in the Senate?
John, would you like to take that?
I think that what we're looking for right now and what the discussion is of what's a bipartisan bill that will get 60 votes in the Senate, and certainly just as in 2013 there were discussions on both sides of the aisle about different provisions that might help us get to 60, and that's what we'll be doing in the weeks that come.
Are there any other questions?
Anybody else? All right,
Well,
thanks everybody.
Yeah, again, thank you for coming out, and thank you everyone for your powerful remarks.